Well, hello, my Econ students. Welcome to the next section of the notes, starting with the Panic of 1893. So before I get into this specifically, let me just give you a quick heads up on what's happening the rest of this unit. So to this point, we have talked about what causes the economy to go into either recession or expansion. We've talked about what the likely government policies would be to stabilize the economy, either with fiscal or monetary policy. We talked about the classical approach, which is the theory that the government should do nothing. The government should just let the economy be. And we've debated, okay, between the government doing something or the government doing nothing, what are some of the pros and cons of each? And so what we're going to do from here on out is we're going to look at three specific economic crises in American history and kind of evaluate what did the government do, what worked, what didn't work, and these are lessons that we can learn and perhaps use as we speak as the government decides how they're going to deal with the current particular crisis. So the three crises we're going to look at today is the Panic of 1893. The next one, which is going to be next week, is the Great Depression, of course. And then we're going to look at the third one is the more recent financial crisis, not the current one, but the one that took place in the mid to late 2000s with the housing market crisis and how that impacted the economy so deeply. And so the idea here again is just kind of evaluate what did the government do, what caused these things, what did the government do about them, what worked and what didn't work, and again, maybe these are lessons we can use going forward. So, as we talk about the Panic of 1893, I want you to stop before we get into all this and ask yourself a question. What do I know about the Panic of 1893? So think about what you may have learned in a previous class. What do you know? What could you tell me without looking at the notes or going over them about it? What caused it? What it was? My guess is from doing this in the past years, asking this to live classes, as I ask the question, what do you know about it? The answer is very little. And part of that is because I think of how it was handled. It was, we kind of overcame this crisis fairly quickly. And I think the government did some good things as they handled this particular crisis, unlike some other crises which tended to linger, like the Great Depression and the more recent crisis. We'll talk about those. But first of all, let's talk about the scope of the Panic of 1893. And this is important to note because you might think, well, the Panic of 1893, I know very little about it. It must have been small. And in the sense that it didn't last long, yes, but as far as like the actual crises itself, it was pretty large, especially at the beginning. So just for some context, at the beginning of the Panic of 1893, and we'll explain what that was in a second, 500 banks and 16,000 businesses had gone out of business, and unemployment was 20%. So this is the beginning of the panic. Those are pretty significant numbers. Now, if you compare that to the beginning of the Great Depression, 1929 is kind of thought of as the beginning of the Great Depression. In 1929, no banks had failed yet. Only a handful of businesses had failed, and unemployment was still 7%. So if you compare the beginnings of these two depressions, the Panic of 1893 seems like it should have been bigger. And by the initial scope, yes, it should have been, and yet it wasn't. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with how the government played it. But anyway, let's talk about the cause of the Panic of 1893. So what happened? So it can all be traced back to, this is the key, the Sherman-Silver Money Act. Now, try to follow me on this, a little bit confusing. So what this did, and this is back in a day, of course, where gold was an important part of our economy. We were no longer on a gold standard. When we talk about the Great Depression, we'll talk about that a little bit more as FDR took us off the gold standard. But back here, gold was very important, gold backing our money. And so the government passed this bill that said, okay, if you owe the government money, they will accept either gold or silver in payment of debt. So if you owe the government money, you can pay them in either gold. And again, people weren't taking sacks of gold to the government. We had certificates or money backed by gold certificates. There are also silver certificates, okay, backed by silver. So people were paying in not gold per se, but money backed by gold or silver. And so if you owed the government money, you could pay either one. Now, put yourself in the position of someone who owes the government money, taxes or whatever, another country owing us money because of a trade deficit. If that's the case, you're going to give the government silver because silver is less valuable than gold. And again, I'm keeping a very complex story simple here. It's not like the choice was either an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver. There was a ratio. There was a 15-to-1 ratio. 1 ounce of gold is equal to 15 ounces of silver. But even at that, silver was inflating in this time period. It was still less valuable, less stable than gold. So bottom line is, okay, none of that made sense. Ignore it. Just know this. If you owed the government money, you would rather pay them in silver because silver was less stable and less valuable than gold. On the other hand, if the government owed you money, guess which one of the two you wanted? Yeah, you wanted gold, right? So here's the problem the government runs into. Everybody is giving the government silver, but the government is giving back all their gold. And so the bottom line is this right here, the Sherman Silver Money Act causes our gold reserves to become depleted, and that creates a financial panic. And again, back then, gold was an important part of the economy. It was considered the foundation of the economy. Today, if we found out the government doesn't have that much gold, it really wouldn't matter very much. Our money is not backed by gold anymore. Our economy is stable enough to not need that necessarily. Back then, though, this was a big deal. People freak out. People stop spending. Businesses stop hiring. The economy kind of goes into this downward spiral. So bottom line is the Sherman Silver Money Act caused our gold reserves to become depleted, which created a panic. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. All right, now, what did the government do about it? So at the time, Grover Cleveland was our president. Now, Grover Cleveland took two, it is not fair to say, let me make this clear, it is not fair to say Grover Cleveland did nothing, okay? He did something, but he took two very specific actions. The first, which is the most obvious thing, is he got rid of the cause of the problem, which was the Sherman Silver Money Act. So number one, he said, let's get rid of this thing since this is causing a problem. Now the government's back to, okay, you owe us money, you got to pay us in gold. Okay, so that's the first thing he did. The second thing Grover Cleveland did is he held gold bond drives. Now, I'm not talking about gold bond powder, the stuff that you put on your legs when you run and you get chub rub and it feels like 1,000 magical fairies blowing cool air all over them. Okay, sorry, I have a little bit of a weight problem. When I run, my legs, my thighs rub together. It's called chub rub, and they chafes, and so you put on gold bond powder. It's amazing. That's not what I'm talking about. Sorry, that was awkward. What I'm talking about are government bonds that could only be purchased in gold. Okay, so the combination of those two things, okay, getting rid of the Sherman Silver Money Act, holding gold bond drives, eventually restores our government's gold reserves. Now, beyond this, he said, we're going to let this thing play out. Grover Cleveland's attitude was we do not want to use the government to alleviate individual suffering. He thought that was best handled by private charities and the church and friends and family and things like that. So he did actions very specific to the problem. Beyond that, he did very little. So, for example, the $2 trillion stimulus package Grover Cleveland absolutely would not be in favor of. Okay, he would say, let's not use the government to do that. Let's just fix the specific problem. He would, in other words, today, I'm going to speculate, Grover Cleveland would be putting a lot of money into medicine, into boosting hospitals and hospital capacity, research and development, and trying to find either a cure or drawing a blank on the word, an inoculation for the virus, okay, a shot that you can take that gives you immunity to it. So he'd be putting money into that. He probably would not be doing all these things with unemployment benefits and bailouts and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of his philosophy. And again, this is a big contrast to FDR. FDR's philosophy seemed to be try anything and everything. So the difference between the two, Grover Cleveland, he has very laser-like focus. Here's the problem, we're going to attack the problem. It's not that he did nothing, he just attacked the problem specifically, whereas FDR, as we're going to learn later, tried almost everything to deal with the Depression. And so, not immediately, but shortly after, as the government's gold reserves became restored again, and people regained confidence, the economy slowly began to recover, and within a couple of years it was kind of back to humming again like it was before the panic. So it didn't last that long. And again, it's kind of a footnote in history. Whereas the Great Depression, which is what we're going to learn about next, there have been more books written on the Great Depression than any other event in American history. Why? Well, because it lasted so long, because it was so drastic, all these other things, but I think part of it was because of how the government handled it. I don't think the government did as many favors, and we're going to look at that with Hoover's actions and some of FDR's actions next time we talk. So, Panic of 1893, that's the big thing. It started out bigger than the Great Depression. What caused it? The Sherman-Silver Money Act, causing our gold reserves to become depleted. What did Grover Cleveland do? Got rid of the Sherman-Silver Money Act, held gold bond drives, restored our gold reserves, restored confidence. The economy's humming again. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. And of course, until next time, stay healthy and happy.